Number 10. Albert Fish. Albert is one of the oldest people on this list, but that does not mean his crimes were any less horrific than anyone else's. Yeah, he was nicknamed the Brooklyn Vampire, or the Moon Maniac, or the Boogeyman. By its name alone, you could probably guess what he did to bodies. Yeah, it's horrible. I can't even talk about it on YouTube. Albert was a terrible human being who did terrible things. Now, in the early 1900s, Albert was arrested, tried, and convicted for killing and consuming 3 people, but the horror was not over yet. Yeah. No, Albert began to claim that although people knew about 3, that number, the real number, was actually close to 100 victims. And he even claimed that he had some in every single state, which is impossible to find now, honestly, and it's horribly disgusting to think about. To make matters even worse, as if it wasn't already terrible enough, he also sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims, and he detailed everything about how he lured the victim in and the rest of these horrible things that occurred afterwards. Number 9. The alphabet. Yet to be identified. Guess I'm not sleeping tonight. Yeah, we're talking cold cases in this list. We're talking unsolved crimes right now, and we're talking about one of the worst. The alphabet killings are a series of unsolved crimes named because of how each victim had first initials that matched their last. So like their first and last name started with the same letter, that type of thing. Details on how the lives were taken and where the remains were placed afterwards, it just connected, right? They were all taken in a similar area around the same time. There are theories and suspects as to who could have committed these horrific crimes, but as of right now, no one knows for sure. These crimes were committed between 1971 and 1973 in Rochester, New York, and because of the timing, it's possible that whoever committed these crimes could still be alive, and perhaps they're not. Who knows? Number 8. Pedro Lopez. Pedro Lopez had a very difficult life growing up. He committed a plethora of horrifying crimes throughout South America during the 1970s. By the time the 80s rolled around, as he made a mistake during one of his awful crimes, this led to his arrest. Now, once in police custody, he spilled everything on basically his entire life and confessed to an insane amount of crimes. Like, we're talking 240 killings on top of the 110 that they already suspected him of. Police were a little skeptical of just how many crimes he said he committed, but Pedro was able to lead them to a mass grave where they recovered a total of 53 people's remains. So, you know, they're probably gonna believe the rest of it. Pedro, of course, went to jail, but get this, he was somehow released in 1994, which is absolutely insane. He was sent to some sort of mental institution for 3 years after, but he was also released from there on good behavior. So aside from the crimes he committed and the fact that they let him go, are you ready for the worst part? In 2002, he was suspected of being the perpetrator of a new crime, but no one has been able to find him since 1998. Number 7. The Long Island Killer. What would a list of horrifying people be without some of the most dreaded unidentified serial killers, right? The most unidentified ones are always the most creepy. The Long Island Killer, of course, operated in the Long Island region and is said to have begun being active right back in the 1996 area, and it's entirely possible that they may currently still be active. Again, it's so recent where it's like, possibly. Recent enough? Maybe. At the moment, there's a range of 10 to 17 crimes that authorities believe could be linked to this yet to be identified person. Unfortunately, there's not much that's known about this person or who they might be or anything like that, although it's currently thought that they're likely a white male in his mid-20s to 40s with extensive knowledge of law enforcement operations and techniques, and they believe this because it would make sense as to why he's been so successful in avoiding capture so far. Number 6. The Doodler. The nickname that this unidentified killer received is due to his practice of sketching his victims before taking their lives. This unidentified killer committed their crimes in the San Francisco area from January 1974 to September 1975, and they specifically targeted the LGBTQ community. It's believed that 14 deaths can be attributed to this killer, while 3 others were injured in the process. Unfortunately, because of stigma and the sensitivities surrounding gay men at the time, the 3 who did survive this monster were very reluctant when speaking with authorities for fear of being, outed as a result of it. This has led, of course, to there being little information for them to work with in terms of identifying the man responsible. For a while, there was a primary suspect, but that person has never been officially charged because sadly, none of the survivors felt comfortable enough to testify in court. There's a very real chance that authorities know who the killer is, but just don't have the evidence yet to prove it in a court of law. The most terrifying thought of all. Number 5. Tex Watson. Tex Watson was one of the central members of the Manson family, which was led, of course, by Charles Manson, and was a willing participant for all of those crimes, specifically the crimes that took place August 9th and 10th, 1969. In October 1969, Tex knew his arrest was coming, so he fled to his home state of Texas, but was later arrested and then, sent back to California, of course. Now, once he was in California, he refused to talk or eat and ended up losing 55 pounds, which got him sent to get tested to see if he was fit to stand trial, which, at that time, he was. In 1971, he was convicted on 7 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of conspiracy to commit. He originally received a death sentence, but ended up being commuted to life in prison sentence. While in prison, apparently this guy's been living the life, it seems, because not only has he been able to release a book while inside, but he also got married, and through visits, he fathered 4 children with her. Number 4. Richard Ramirez. Richard, who is also known as the Night Stalker, was a serial killer who terrorized the streets of LA back in the 80s. He was known for invading homes, which left him initially being dubbed as the Walk-In Zodiac Killer, but he had another signature that was, of course, concerning to many people. This was during the height of the Satanic Panic, so yeah, buckle up. Richard was known for leaving behind different satanic messages at the scene of all of his crimes. Because of his satanic signature, after he left his first pentagram at the scene of a crime, authorities became worried that he was a Charles Manson copycat. But instead, he was just his own, one-of-a-kind monster. It is said that he would leave more pentagrams behind while also telling his victims to swear to Satan instead of swearing to God. During his court appearances, he would hold up a pentagram, and after pleading not guilty, he said, "Hail Satan." Number 3. Charles Cullen. He used to be a nurse, and he took the lives of his patients throughout his career, and he may be one of the worst serial killers ever recorded. He confessed to taking the lives of 40 people, but through following interviews, it became apparent that the number was way higher than 40. Yeah, he just couldn't remember the names of them all. Yeah, just that many he couldn't remember. But he of course could remember the details of his crimes against them. His crimes started in 1988 and spanned over a decade into 2003. In October 2003, when a patient passed away from low blood sugar, the authorities were called. This person was Charles' final victim, and authorities began looking into him and investigating his past employment history. On December 12, 2003, authorities were arresting him and charging him with only one count of his crimes, but he ended up admitting to 40. He ended up pleading guilty to his crimes and arranged a plea deal where authorities would not seek the death penalty if he cooperated. During one of his court proceedings, he continually asked the judge to step down, and apparently he repeatedly chanted, "Your Honor, you need to step down." He repeatedly chanted that over and over, 25 minutes straight. Even after he was restrained and gagged for his outbursts, he kept going. It's thought that his victims might be up in the 400 range, which is truly just unbelievable and so tragic. But Charles was sentenced to 8 consecutive life sentences and will be eligible for parole in 2403. Nice. Number 2, Aidan K. This Turkish serial killer is responsible for taking the lives of 11 women who were all between the ages of 68 and 95. He was also responsible for 6 other crimes that were, of course, also elderly women, sadly, so there's a horrible theme going on here in his life. It's absolutely disgusting. Now, down the road, he eventually gets caught for said horrible crimes, and he was sentenced to 6 death sentences as well as 40 years in prison. Now, this was back in 1995 when he was first sentenced, but cut to 2004, the death penalty in Turkey was abolished, which meant that in May 2005, Aidan K. was released from jail. And finally, number 1, Charlene Gallego. A match made in hell, it seems. Here we go. Back in the late 70s, Charlene Gallego, alongside her twisted husband, Gerald, they were the worst in Sacramento, California. They kidnapped and then later killed 10 victims. But when they kidnapped them, they kept them and then they abused them for a while, horribly, before ultimately ending their lives. It really was the most twisted situation possible. Just disgusting people. Now, cut to 1984, Charlene pleads guilty to murder and receives 16 years. Her husband was waiting for execution, but he died of cancer before meeting that fate, so nice. But Charlene, she got out and moved to Fair Oaks, California, where she has since changed her name. So we have no idea where she is or who she is, so you can sleep on that.
Starting off at number 10, we have Nick Yaris. In 1981, Nick was convicted of murder and received the death penalty. Now, Nick has a history of drugs and theft, yet he claims that he never committed murder. After being arrested for a car theft, Yaris thought that if he gave fake details about a crime he read in the paper, then he could just bargain his way out of the charges. The case in the paper was of a murder of a young woman. However, this plan went terribly wrong, as Nick was convicted of this murder. Nick spent 23 years on death row waiting for his execution. Finally, DNA evidence cleared his name and he was let out of jail. So yeah, don't lie to the police. Don't try and scam your way out of jail because it could end up much worse, like this guy. But hey, apparently Nick thanks death row for actually saving his life. Sounds weird, but he said that if he wasn't in jail, then he would have wound up dead or have been a severe drug addict like his other friends.
Coming in at number 9 is Nelly Madison. In 1935, Nelly was convicted of murder and sentenced to death for shooting husband number 5, Eric Madison. To clarify, she hadn't shot 4 previous husbands, he just happened to be her 5th husband. The state Supreme Court upheld the sentence, which was the first time it was ever done for a woman. They wanted to get her good and didn't like the fact she wasn't breaking down on the stand or crying in court. She was the Iron Woman. Nelly met Eric in 1930, and after learning she had a big inheritance, he proposed to her 3 years later. A year into it, Nelly came home to find Eric in bed with a 16-year-old girl. He then beat her, telling her that he tricked her into marrying him because he wanted the money. He continued physically abusing her for 6 more days before Nelly bought a gun, intending just to scare him. On the fateful night in question, the two were arguing in the bedroom when she pulled out the gun. Eric then got a bunch of butcher knives from under the bed because they were just conveniently there and started throwing them at her. In self-defense, she shot him in the back 5 times. So a simple homicide it was not. Her sentence was then reduced to life in prison, but she was completely freed 9 years later.
Moving on to number 8, we have Richard Glossip. Richard Glossip was convicted of conspiracy to murder and then was charged with the murder of Barry Von Treese, the owner of the motel that he worked at. Now, Richard was convicted based on the word of one person, Justin Sneed, his fellow co-worker and a drug addict. Justin was a man who committed the crime and stated that Glossip made him do it. Justin received a life sentence, but Glossip was sentenced to execution by drug injection. Now, this is an example that shows how flawed this system is. Apparently, there isn't any evidence supporting that Glossip told Sneed to commit the crime, so people just believe that he made it up to get out of a harsher sentence. Now, on the day of his execution, he was actually granted a stay of the execution, and only a couple hours beforehand. This is the second time he was granted a stay. This was due to the fact that they had the wrong drug in possession. Apparently, they received potassium acetate instead of potassium chloride. So, twice, Richard avoided the death penalty. Sadly, he is now back on death row as he is still trying to clear his name.
Filling at number 7 slot is Damien Thibodeau, and surprisingly, I definitely heard his name before researching him, probably on TV in passing. Either way, in 1996, Damien confessed to raping and murdering his 14-year-old step-cousin and was sentenced to death, but this confession was false. Damien had been subjected to a grueling 9-hour interrogation session, and I feel like we've heard so many cases where officers literally beat you down, make you think of a new reality almost, or even convince you that you've done something that you haven't. At the end of it all you want to do is just tell them what they want to hear just so it ends. By 2012, he had spent 15 years on death row but was finally exonerated after DNA evidence proved that he was not the perpetrator.
In our 6th spot, we have Clyde Thompson. Now, this next criminal is named the meanest man in Texas for the crimes that he committed. Clyde Thompson has a life of crime, from being involved in robbery to being convicted of 4 murders. The first murder being when he was only 17 years old. When he was arrested for this murder, he was sentenced to death by electric chair. At that time, he was the youngest man to ever receive a death penalty. Clyde clearly had luck on his side because his death penalty was changed to life in prison. This was granted to him 2 days before his execution. Why did they change their mind? Well, David Thomas was Clyde's friend that also was convicted for helping Clyde commit his first murder. Since David didn't receive the death penalty, Clyde's sentence was changed as well. And that's how the meanest man in Texas escaped the electric chair.
Coming in at number 5 is Anthony Ray Hinton. In 1985, he was convicted of murdering 2 fast food restaurant managers in Birmingham and sentenced to death. The reason behind this conviction was the fact that ballistic evidence linked the gun used for the crime to one owned by his mother. He was found guilty despite having a solid alibi for the time of the murders, but I guess it was the 80s and people needed no reason to end a black man's life. Did you hear that? Someone just say judicial racism? I think they did. In 2014, an appeal for the case reached the US Supreme Court, who remanded the case and allowed for a retrial. With a new ballistics expert in tow, Hinton's team was able to prove that the gun owned by his mom was not the murder weapon, nor was it even connected to the murders, and he was freed after spending 30 bloody years on death row. And no, racism in this system has still not ended.
Moving on at number 4, we have Glenn Stark Chambers. In 1975, Glenn was convicted of murdering his 22-year-old girlfriend. As a result, he was on death row. They eventually changed his sentence to life in prison, but the story doesn't stop there. On February 21st in 1990, Glenn escaped the Florida Correctional Facility and hasn't been found since. He had escaped once before, but that attempt was unsuccessful and he was just caught and brought back to jail. However, this time he escaped and people believe that he's still out there. Apparently, Glenn was too smart for his own good. While making furniture, his inmates packed him in a box, which was then loaded in a truck and taken away. From there, he escaped, leaving only his clothes behind. He would be 69 years old if he was still alive, so maybe be careful and double check to make sure you really know who your neighbors are.
At number 3 is Michelle Byram. In 1999, Michelle was convicted of hiring one of her son's friends to murder her husband. Little did everyone know, the husband was extremely abusive, and the son actually confessed to Michelle that he had killed him himself. Plot twist. Hearing this, without hesitation, Michelle took the blame in order to protect his son. Claiming self-defense did nothing for her case, and she was sentenced to death. That was in 1999. In 2014, her time finally came, and mere hours before administering the lethal injection, the Mississippi Supreme Court court agreed she did in fact not receive a fair trial. Her conviction was then vacated and she was released after spending 15 years on death row.
In our second spot, we have Lester Eubanks. In 1965, Lester was convicted of the murder of a young girl named Mary Ellen Diener. As a result, he was sentenced to the death penalty. However, the Supreme Court changed their mind, saying the death penalty was unconstitutional. As a result, he was sentenced to life. Now, apparently, Lester was so well behaved that they allowed him to go Christmas shopping. And oh, what a mistake that was. On December 7th, 1973, that's when he went Christmas shopping, and that is also the last time he was ever seen. To this day, this criminal is still out there. They have come up with a bunch of sketchings on what Lester would look like now. It's terrifying knowing that there's a murderer still out there somewhere in this world.
And finally, at number 1 is Pablo Ibar. Now, I've never heard of Casey's Nickelodeon murders, so maybe you guys haven't either. In 1994, Butch Casey, the owner of Casey's Nickelodeon, and 2 of his employees, Sharon Anderson and Marie Rogers, were killed in a triple homicide in his own home. The whole thing was orchestrated by 2 men and was all caught on surveillance footage, which I watched, and it's not super graphic, but it is just very disturbing. After it was over, one of them actually took the t-shirt that was covering his face off, and prosecutors believed it was Pablo Ibar. Pablo was then put behind bars for 25 years, 16 of which were death row for the triple homicide. There was DNA found at the scene that did not match Pablo that defense emphasized was from the real culprit. After being convicted guilty in more than 1 trial, Pablo finally got a break in his 4th trial where the jury came to a verdict of life imprisonment as opposed to capital punishment. I feel like you really can't execute someone because they sort of look similar to someone you saw on grainy camera footage. Like, where is the logic behind that?
Number 10. David Berkowitz. Also known as the son of Sam, David Berkowitz is a killer who again thinks that he works for the devil, which is obviously a horrible start. This time, the real culprit for the horrible crimes was a demon who had taken the shape of a dog that belonged to his neighbors. That's who he put all the blame on. So you ever find yourself in some hot water, just blame the neighbor's demon dog. See if that works for you. David led authorities on one of the largest manhunts ever seen in New York, and in true twisted killer fashion, he left notes behind, trying to be arrogant, trying to be cool, thinking he would never get caught. You know, working a 9 to 5 in the underworld, you'd think there'd be more places to duck out and hide, but oddly enough, David was caught, and oddly enough, he was convicted. He later admitted to making up the dog story, which I called off the hop, I knew it. But he did say that he was a member of a violent satanic cult and his crimes were committed as part of that. So I was like, hey, it's good. No, it's actually way worse. Now we're talking about cults. Number 9, Robert Picton. This horrible person is one of the worst Canadians to ever live and is one of our country's worst serial killers ever. Picton dropped out of school and began working at his family's pig farm, and this is where most of his absolutely horrific crimes took place. He was first arrested in 2002 and was convicted in 2007, taking the lives of 6 people, but throughout a long investigation, evidence of many more killings ended up coming to light. So it was bad at first with 6, and then it went way up. During his time in jail, an undercover police officer posed as his cellmate, and Picton actually confessed to him. He confessed to 49 crimes, so a little higher than 6. Apparently he was saying to said undercover officer that he wanted to take one more life and make it an even 50, and that he only got caught because he was, quotes, sloppy. The entire trial was a bit of a mess, but it led to a life sentence without the possibility of parole for 25 years, which was the longest possible sentence under Canadian law at the time. This unfortunately does mean that he will be eligible for parole within the next decade, so let's hope, you know, nothing happens anymore with this guy. Let's just keep them locked away. You know, like after 42, you're like, no, people can't change, actually. Number 8, Chester Turner. Chester is an American serial killer who on April 30th, 2007 was convicted of taking the lives of 11 women in the Los Angeles area. And on June 19th, 2014, he was convicted of 4 more that they were able to then tie back to him. He has been referred to by prosecutors as one of the most prolific serial killers in the city's history, and if you know anything about Los Angeles history, that's crazy. In his original trial that led to conviction, Chester was sentenced to death, but at the following trial in 2014, he also received an additional sentence to death. Now we're at 2, that's lovely. In the end, like with a lot of these kinds of stories, in the end, DNA came to save the day and help authorities find out who was committing these horrible crimes. So yeah, science changing the game. Who done it? Number 7, the Zodiac Killer. This one had to make it on the list because, well, it had to. There's a plethora of terrifying people on this list. Nothing is as terrifying as an uncaught serial killer, and the Zodiac is definitely the most prolific of that category. The Zodiac Killer, they made movies about this guy. The Zodiac Killer took the lives of 5 people in the the San Francisco Bay Area between December 1968 and October 1969. He was most known for targeting young couples, sadly, or lone male cab drivers. Despite 2 people luckily and thankfully escaping his attempted evil doings, he has still never been caught. Number 6. Albert Fish. Albert is one of the oldest people on this list. Got a bit of an old head here. He was dubbed the Brooklyn Vampire. He was also dubbed the Moon Maniac. He was also dubbed the Boogeyman, so again, cool nicknames for cool dudes, love it. It's clear that Albert was a terrible human being who did terrible things, that's why he's on this list. In the early 1900s, for example, Albert was arrested, tried, and convicted for killing and then consuming 3 people, but the horror was not over yet. No, as if it could get any worse than that. No, Albert began to claim that although people knew about 3 of these killings, the number was actually closer to 100, give or take, and he even claimed that he had some in every state, which is the most disgusting thing I've ever heard. And to make matters even worse, as if again wasn't already terrible enough, this deranged lunatic also sent a letter to the mother of one of his victims, just detailing everything about how he lured her and the rest of these horrific events that took place afterwards. I can't even talk about it, but that's the worst thing I've ever heard, I think. That's one of the worst things I've ever heard. Number 5. Jeffrey Dahmer. Jeffrey is one of the most well-known serial killers, with his crimes taking place from 1978 to 1991. Have you watched the Netflix movie or the documentary? One of the hundreds of things on murderers now, for some reason. Every killer gets his own Netflix special, apparently. Well, his crimes are far too brutal for this channel, but he's known for taking the lives of 17 different people. Again, if you've seen the documentary, you know what's up here. At his trial, not only did he plead not guilty, but his attorney had some pretty interesting words for the court. His attorney said that he became enamored, overwhelmed, even caught up in a character from the movie Exorcist 3. Which character? Well, he got caught up in the character of Satan, because, you know, he's the personification of evil. Who better, right? Not only was Jeffrey found to be sane and ended up being sentenced to multiple life sentences in prison, spoiler alert, but not too long after his sentence started, he was killed by a fellow inmate. Nice, I wonder if the devil made him do it. Number 4, John Bodkin Adams. He was once a general practitioner in the British community in Essex. Most of his patients were elderly, and he treated said elderly patients with care. For a bit. From 1946 to 1956, John had around 160 patients that died suspiciously, and that out of those 160, 132 of them left valuables for him. Wow, what are the odds? Must have been some really great care he was providing. Must have really touched their hearts. Not fishy at all in any way, shape, or form. Of course, the wills were later to be found fraudulent because, well, as per this list, obviously, you could have guessed. Worst part of all this, John was acquitted. His trial established the doctrine of double effect, which is where a doctor giving treatment with the aim of relieving pain may lawfully, as an unintentional result, shorten their lives. So they're like, sometimes it happens, 132 times. So out of the dozens of cases that ended horribly, Adams was charged for only 2. That's it. He wasn't even convicted of their deaths even. He was guilty of forging prescriptions and falsifying medical forms. Number 3, Wonlin. Who started his life in jail in the early 1900s, and he was there as a result of human trafficking charges. Right off the bat, he's just, yep, go away, bye-bye now. You would think once inside, prisoners would have a tough time continuing said practice, but not Wonlin. While in jail, he kicked off his own medical practice, and then in 1997, after a retrial, Who was released from prison. Now, once released, Who continued this medical practice that he started, again, behind bars, must I remind you. Again, he's not a doctor. Not really, he's not a medical practitioner. He's just a guy who was reading some books in jail. So for the next few years, he treated many people with this herbal remedy that actually contains sodium sulfate, which is very lethal. It is suspected that because of this, he ended up taking the lives of 146 people. Who was arrested, again, in 1999, and was sentenced to only 15 years in prison for practicing medicine without a license. Yeah, that's the charge you're gonna get. Okay. Shortly after his, again, release in 2014, it's believed that he was responsible for another death, this time of a 22-year-old student. Now, don't get me wrong, I believe people can change, you know, to a certain degree, like Robert Downey Jr. changed, you know, this type of stuff. No, you can't risk having these people in public. It's not fair. 146 lives, we gotta avoid this at all costs. Number 2, Ahem Cardinal. One of the worst when it comes to Turkey serial killers. His nickname by the media, because apparently, like I said, everyone gets a cool DC villain's nickname. His nickname is the Izmir Monster. He killed a young woman in the mid-80s, but once he was checked into a mental hospital, he was either released or he escaped. It's a little bit blurry, but he did this multiple times. And then once he was out, he would repeat said disgusting crimes and then go back in. It was just a terrible, broken, vicious circle. He would leave, assault somebody, and be sent back. It was the worst. Clearly something was not working. He shouldn't have been released once, nor should he have escaped, obviously. But after an escape in 2000, he was caught, and then something really bizarre happened. You ever hear about the old story where the only two vehicles in the world, there was like only 2 cars, and they somehow ended up crashing? Here we go. He was killed by somebody else on this list. He was killed by this next evil person coming up at number 1. Number 1, Alikaya. Yep, it's all about who you know. Imagine running in 2 killers running into each other. This is what happens. Nicknamed the Babyface Killer, Alikaya was convicted of 10 killings, but in 2012, the man was released after a report stated that he had a mental disorder. So this obviously leads into some other stuff. His next step at this point is perhaps everybody's worst nightmare. He immediately attacked those who had testified against him during his original trial. He ended up taking the lives of 3 of those people and leaving 2 others injured. He was then recaptured in 2013. Thankfully, nobody else got hurt after his initial release. But remember that horrible guy I just mentioned at number 2, Ahem Cardinal? Well, when he was finally put back into that mental facility after escaping and killing over and over, this is the guy that ended up taking his life in jail. What do you know? You played yourself. Alikaya killed Ahem Cardinal in jail in 2000. Small world. I guess it's all about who you know, or who you should know, or who you shouldn't know, I guess in this case. Yeah, ironic, but twisted nonetheless.
Starting us off with number 10 is Polybius. Now this urban legend started circulating around 1981 in Portland, Oregon, and it was actually an arcade game. It was apparently so popular it got players super addicted to the point lines started forming around the game and people would regularly fight over turns. Legend has it that the game was actually a government-run crowdsourced psychological experiment. Many reported seeing men in black visit the machines in order to collect unknown data from them. Apparently they would test the responses to the game for psychoactive effects, and most users suffered from hallucinations, amnesia, insomnia, and night terrors. It was said it was a CIA experiment spun off MK Ultra, which was a psychoactive drug study done on unsuspecting subjects, which I don't even think is legal, but then again isn't half the stuff the CIA does illegal. The game randomly disappeared without a trace from all arcade markets a month after its release, and that was the end of that. Fun fact of the day, other than this whole video, Polybius was also the name of a Greek historian who is known for his claim that historians should never report on things they can't verify through eyewitnesses, which I feel links to the game also. They wanted to collect first-hand primary data to verify whatever they were trying to find out, whether they did or not, who knows. Coming in at number 9 is Jane Wallace Burrell. Now Jane was the first CIA officer ever to die in the agency's service, but her death remains a bit of a mystery. Jane joined the OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, and worked as an analyst. The chief of counterintelligence at the time, James Murphy, liked promoting women he saw potential in because he thought they paid better attention to detail than the men employed. And you're not wrong, James, you're not wrong. I got a haircut last week, guys, and I feel like probably none of the guy viewers even noticed, but my girls did, and that's the tea. Either way, she soon ended up in X2, and a lot of her personnel documentation started having a lot of contradictions and ambiguities. On January 6, 1948, Jane was on her way from Brussels to Paris when the plane crashed on its approach to the airport, killing all crew members and 10 out of 11 passengers. Press reports said Jane was a clerk or a courier, but they were obviously wrong. Official documents shed no light on what the purpose of Jane's trip was. It said she was on an operational mission, but a US spokesperson said she was just on holiday. Again, I don't know how trustworthy her documents are, considering all her documents were riddled with mistakes anyway. Either way, she didn't even end up on the CIA's memorial wall because those are only for employees that died on missions. I think that's the biggest snub if I ever saw one. At number 8, we have Project MK Ultra. This isn't really an urban legend because we all know it happened, but it was technically meant to be a secret, and it was for a very long time. Secret and illegal. From 1953 to 1964, the CIA launched this project in which they secretly tested the effects of drugs on hundreds of Americans that had no idea. They used to use hookers to lure unsuspecting unsuspecting men for testing, and narcos would even just go and slip the drugs into people's drinks. The project examined the effects of LSD, acid, and other barbiturates, and I know it seems screwed up and random, but they did so because the US government thought the Soviet Union was using these drugs to hypnotize captured Americans, so they didn't want to fall behind in any way at all. So let's just drug our population. They would literally drug randomers and then follow them and see what they would do. US Marshal Wayne Ritchie got dosed with acid at a bar with other officers, and then the room started spinning, and then he went upstairs to drink water, but it got a lot worse. He thought he was being assassinated, so he thought he would try to get them first by getting his guns and getting money for his girlfriend to buy a ticket out of there. He went into the bar, pointed his gun at the bartender, and demanded money. He was eventually subdued and arrested and had to leave the marshal service, and only 40-something years later he realized he was on acid the day he went crazy. In 1973, CIA director ordered all documents about and from the project to be destroyed. Filling our number 7 slot is Acoustic Kitty, and I promise you this one is not a joke. A report from the CIA in 1967 stated that the CIA spent $20 million to try and train cats to spy on Soviet embassies and the Kremlin. Dubbed Acoustic Kitty, the program involved implanting a microphone in the cat's ear canal and a small radio transmitter at the bottom of its skull. This would allow the cat to record and transmit anything it was hearing. Although it sounds like a foolproof plan, they encountered problems with the cats. Mainly they just kept getting distracted and or hungry. The first kitty on a mission was meant to spy on 2 men standing outside a Soviet compound, but our brave compadre was hit and killed by a taxi on its way there. The project got disclosed in 2001, and I think this is the funniest thing I've heard to date. After they realized the project was clearly a fail, all the implanted cats were reoperated on and went on to live 9 happy lives. Except the one that got hit by a taxi. RIP. Now at number 6 is Operation Paperclip. Now this was a secret, clearly not so secret program of the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, and it was an OSS and Army CIC program that aimed to lure and recruit German engineers, scientists, and technicians from Germany to America to obviously be employed there. They did so to aid America's post-war efforts and to also make sure that the most valuable scientific knowledge would end up in their hands rather than the Soviet Union's. And surprisingly enough, many of the Germans recruited were former leaders or members of the Nazi Party. They even managed to steal rocket scientist Werner von Braun and his V2 rocket team, who eventually went on to mastermind NASA's Apollo moon missions, hence making the US the winner of the space race when it could have very well been the Soviet Union. But they just went in their sleight of hand. Coming in at number 5 is Tupac Shakur. I know there are many theories out there that claim Tupac is still alive, hiding somewhere, maybe on an island in the Bahamas, perhaps, or in the countryside of Scandinavia, who really knows. But some people think the CIA killed Tupac. When the CIA first joined Twitter in 2014, they took 10 minutes to answer the top 5 questions they got, and obviously where is Tupac was a very popular question. Their official reply was no, we don't know where Tupac is, #Twitterversary. But even their blatant denial didn't have many people convinced. Many people were replying saying, would the CIA even tell us if they did know? That even the denial makes them even more sure that they killed him, etc. I mean, true, they probably wouldn't tell us if they did know, so I mean, it's all up in the air really. At number 4 is the kidnapping of the Lunik. This document was declassified by the CIA, and it basically tells the story of a CIA-led mission to borrow a lunar satellite from the Soviet Union. Borrowing happened in the early 60s at the peak of the space race. At this point, the Soviet Union were actually winning, and to rub salt in the US's wound, they launched a multinational exhibition of their Lunik satellite, which was the first spacecraft ever to reach near the moon. On that fateful night, undercover CIA agents persuaded the driver who was transporting the satellite from city to city to have a nap at a hotel nearby and leave the satellite with them. First of all, that guy's a dumbass for doing that, but also everyone has a price, they probably bribed him. While he napped, they took the satellite apart, took pictures of its parts, and then put it back on the truck. And to make matters worse, the Soviets had no idea this even happened until they declassified the document. Damn B, you guys got played. big time. Filling our number 3 slot is Operation Northwoods. We already know that during the Cold War, the US and Cuba had a very tense, strained relationship. Having done international relations at uni, my whole degree was literally the Cold War, so I feel like I could talk about this in my sleep. Either way, the US government and the CIA undertook many schemes to try and take down Fidel Castro, including Operation Mongoose, which included just straight up killing him, which would totally be subtle. Operation Northwoods proposed the CIA commit acts of terrorism against American civilians and military targets and then blame it on the Cuban government to justify waging war against Cuba. How screwed up is that even? I wish I could use a stronger word, but it's gonna get bleeped out for sure, I know. And they were talking like hijackings, bombings, the full shebang, even planting false evidence to implicate the Cuban government. In 1998, the NSA published declassified documents about the operation that never actually ended up happening, and the Kennedy administration said they recognized the problem with the operation, great, finally, and then rejected their proposal. I mean, at least it didn't go through. There is that. There's always a pro. Now at number 2 is the crack era. Back in the late 90s, the San Francisco Bay Area drug rings sold huge amounts of cocaine to the gangs of LA, poured millions in drug profits to a guerrilla army that was run by the CIA itself. This drug network was the bridge between Colombia's cartels and LA, which later became the crack capital of the world. Investigative journalist Gary Webb published an extremely controversial 3-part newspaper series on the situation in 1996, essentially exposing the CIA. It was even dubbed the most talked about piece of journalism in 1996. So what followed? Having talked to people that lived during that time, they were saying things like, none of us even owned planes, how else do you think crack got here? I mean, they're not wrong. 3 huge newspapers, the LA Times, the New York Times, and the Washington Post, all teamed up with the CIA to send out intercept reports to discredit his series, and they succeeded. By the end of 2004, Webb actually committed suicide. His story was actually made into a movie called Kill the Messenger, and it will never be confirmed whether the CIA really did fuel the crack epidemic in LA or not, but evidence does point that way. What do you guys think? And finally, at number 1 is Frank Olson. Frank was a biological warfare specialist and a CIA employee with their technical services staff. Many of his co-workers were even involved in Project MKUltra, which was basically the whole drugs on random people project. He worked at Camp Detrick, and during a meeting at Deep Creek Lake in Maryland, he was dosed with LSD by his CIA supervisor. The next day, Olson spoke to his boss and told him he was unhappy with his performance at the retreat and wanted to leave Camp Detrick. Obviously, he had no idea he'd been on LSD, so no he wasn't happy with his performance. After the LSD episode, Frank started experiencing severe paranoia and nervous breakdowns. The CIA sent him to a mental institution for recovery, and he was seen by Harold Abramson, an allergist pediatrician who was helping the CIA with Project Ultra. 9 days later, after the LSD episode, he magically fell out of a 10th-story window and died. Initially, the US government was adamant that it was a suicide, then they said it was a misstep, and then people started speculating the CIA murdered him. After his family requested performing a second autopsy, they found cuts and abrasions all over his body, a huge hematoma was found on his head, and a large injury on his chest. That implied he had suffered blunt force trauma to his head and chest before the fall. The evidence pointed to murder. Frank's sons have been adamant on finding out the truth of the dad's death ever since, and are convinced this was the CIA's first manual assassination.